Good morning, good afternoon, good day everyone to this celebration of 40 years since the adoption of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, with a particular emphasis
Where is France coming from?
Relations to South Africa. We will have some official words of welcome.
Hello. I think it's time that we start our afternoon session. Remember, we've been running late, and so we want to save on time as much as possible this afternoon. I have the pleasure to welcome the group from the Global Classroom Southeast Europe research team led by Professor Marina. So maybe before we open, I would like to give the floor to you to introduce your team and the topic, and then they can roll from there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for introducing us, Tade. So I have really great pleasure to work with this wonderful team from Southeastern Europe. Alisa Berezina, Nataša Ivaneja, Samatik Sordorakis, not good enough, okay, and Veronika Vasilic. And they were working on the paper that has a still provisional title, Socio-Economic Status of Internally Displaced People in Southeastern Europe, Cases of Serbia, Bosnia, and Herzegovina, and Kosovo. So I'm just briefly to introduce the paper, and then I will give the floor to my colleagues. So the main aim of the paper is to shed a light on 30-year-long problem of internally displaced people in former Yugoslavia, specifically in Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Kosovo. So in this paper, my colleagues will present the social, political, and economic context of IDPs in these three countries by analyzing the existing legal framework and policies. And furthermore, through interviews with victims and people who work closely with them, they plan to show the several layers of discrimination that IDPs in this region face. So I will just give a very short introduction background about the topic. The wars in former Yugoslavia left an enduring mark on the region, and the consequences is still felt. The Yugoslav Wars, just to remind you, were a series of separated but related armed conflicts in Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Kosovo that lasted from 1991 to 2000. These conflicts, accompanied with the political and social transformation of socialist political system, produced a unique combination of issues, making local societies at the same time post-conflict or post-socialist or post-communist. The wars created a huge flow on internally displaced persons especially in Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Serbia. And as Mariah Catt recently argued, although the public gaze of the media has long since moved on elsewhere and donors have shifted their resources, the problem of internally displaced people in former Yugoslavia remained an important issue for many who still feel the effects of the war. And there are various issues in both defining and then counting IDPs in those countries. So we decided to use the internationally recognized term IDP for people who were displaced from their homes during the wars in former Yugoslavia. But we are also following Charles Philpott, who in the article published in Journal of Refugees Studies argues that, and I'm quoting, in addition to those formally registered under anti-displaced person legalization, the term was also used to designate any person displaced from their pre-war home. In some instances, the term was even applied to persons displaced between the republics of the former Yugoslavia. So we also use the term in the broadest possible sense in order to include so-called floaters, people of the minority ethnicity living in their pre-war municipality, but preventing from returning to their pre-war homes, as well as those usually called domicile displaced persons, who are those of the dominant ethnic group living in a different property, but still in their pre-war municipality. The International Committee of the Red Cross also states that as regards of Serbia and Montenegro, all citizens of the country whose homes were in Kosovo, regardless of their nationality or religious affiliation, are considered to be IDPs. So because of all those issues, numbers of IDPs in the region are disputed. But according to the International Displacement Monitoring Center in 2019, there were more than 95,000 internally displaced people in Bosnia and Herzegovina due to war, and more than 60,000 internally displaced people in Kosovo. Some of those people are still living in collective shelters. Collective shelters or collective centers were shelters made during or immediately after the war for short-term accommodation, but they remain permanent until today in many places. So, for example, the UNHCR 2019 fact sheet of Kosovo states that out of those 16,000 displaced people within Kosovo, more than 400 are still living in temporary collective shelters. In Serbia, in 2013, there was almost 200 people living in communal shelters, and latest data show that there are around 100 today. But in Bosnia and Herzegovina, 8,000 people who lost their homes during the wars in the 1990s are still in collective centers. Until the end of this year, Bosnian government is planning to close those temporary accommodation, but actually, as we recently read, they postponed that decision for the next year. IDPs in the region require obviously special assistance that has to be the result of coordinating action between higher levels of state organization and social work centers. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, that is a Commission for Displaced Persons and Refugees, and in Serbia, Commission for Refugees and Migration. But at the local level, actually, the Center for Social Works and those who are working much more on the ground and grassroots level, and there are very few research on the topic. Of course, there are also people who went back to their pre-war homes, and they face various obstacles. Some houses are not completely restored, and there is lack of infrastructure, including electricity. Moreover, there are obstacles in claiming previously acquired rights, including pension and tenancy rights. And I will just briefly say something about tenancy rights, property rights in former Yugoslavia. There were two types of main types of property rights: private and socially owned. Socially owned property were mostly urban apartments in state-owned buildings, while rural houses were privately owned. The transition from occupancy rights to private property has just started at the beginning of the 1990s, and many people did not buy out their apartments before the war. While in the immediate post-war period, wartime allocations that someone actually moved to someone else's home were mostly unchanged but rather consolidate. Although new property laws enacted after the war allow property right holders or their legal successor to apply for the restitution of property, but of course there are still some problems in actually for people to move back from their homes. In addition, access to property rights is not always the main obstacle to return. There are problems of reintegration in their community, security concerns, and lack of education or employment opportunities. So in this paper, we are going to explore some of those difficulties, focusing on both those who still live in collective centers and those who return to their homes but still face reintegration obstacles. And we argue that continued political economic transformation of the country and the region affect both housing rights, employment, social rights and provisions, and also affect rights of IDPs. So I now give the floor to the students.
Hello, everyone from my side. Yeah, okay. Hello, everyone from my side. We're going to be looking together about the situation of IDPs in Kosovo. It's the red area on the map. But before we go there, a short history lesson from my side in order for everyone to be familiarized with the uniqueness and particularity of Kosovo. My colleague Marina talked about the Yugoslav Wars. One of these wars was the 98-99 Kosovo conflict that led to displacement of many people. After the Kosovo War was between Kosovo Liberation Army and the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, consisting of Serbia and Montenegro at the time. After the war in 1999, there was signed the UN Security Council Resolution 1244, which established international civilian and military presence in Kosovo in order to go through transitional administration and security presence in the country. The first part was United Nations mission, UNMIC, from 1999 until 2008, which was the year of independence of Kosovo. And after that, we had the president of European Union under the mission of EUMIC. Until today, their mandate is extended until 2023. Today, Kosovo remains partially recognized state. We have today just 117 countries recognizing it. South Africa, since we're here, doesn't recognize it. Also, Kosovo is not a member state in the United Nations, mostly because of Russia's veto. Kosovo, the data depends regarding who writes the report, but the most prevalent data say that around 98% consist of ethnic Albanians, 1.5% is Serbians, and then 0.5% is other minorities. Kosovo is the newest state in Europe. It was declared its independence in 2008, and it's also one of the youngest nations. The average age in Kosovo is 29 years old. So regarding now, let's jump into the IDPs. We see that the IDPs are decreasing. We had the first mass escalation after the 98-99 conflict, and then in 2004, when we had another conflict re-escalation. According to the latest data by UNHCR, we have around 16,000 IDPs remaining in Kosovo, but there is also conflicting data. We'll go soon to that. 60% also of IDPs in Kosovo belong to minorities, either ethnic, national, language, or religious communities, which also is very crucial to highlight, because then we see the intersectionality of discrimination, not only because of the place of displacement, but also because of their minority status. Taking a look into conflicting data, one of the most prevalent reports was from Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. In 2012, they called about almost 18,000 displaced people, and they also mapped them. So I want us to take a clear look at the map, because you will see that in the northern region of Mitrovica is where most of IDPs are placed. Mitrovica is a segregated region. So the northern part of Mitrovica is where Serbian IDPs are based that were displaced from all over the country. And the southern part of Mitrovica is where ethnic Albanians are located, which were people who were displaced from northern Mitrovica. Until today, Mitrovica is a segregated city. It's divided by a canal and it has a bridge. The bridge always has the EULEX mission. People still do not cross. It's very interesting because the northern part of Mitrovica has Serbian dinners, Serbian flags, Serbian language, and the northern part has Euros, Albanian language, and of course the Serbian part is declaring the whole country as Serbia, but the northern part declares the whole country and uses the whole country to be Kosovo. So 40% of all IDPs are Serbian IDPs who are located in northern Mitrovica, and 40% of the others are ethnic Albanian IDPs that are located in South Mitrovica. Okay, so the second report we had in 2016 was a collaboration of organizations both from Serbia and Kosovo, and they actually talk about 23,000 IDPs. That's little over a quarter than the reports we've been seeing so far. One explanation would be that they had higher number of IDPs because we had more IDPs in the recent years, but that's not valid because the last IDPs we had was from the conflict re-escalation in 2004. So our understanding about the discrepancy in the data is that because both Serbian authorities and Kosovo authorities work together on this project, probably the question of who counts as IDP, which is a politicized question, was revisited. That's why we had a higher number of IDPs in Kosovo. Additionally, it's worth to highlight, as you see in the report in 2016, UNHCR was one of the conductors of the report. However, after the report in 2016, UNHCR's reports never used the data. They keep on using the data provided by IDMC. Okay. Now let's talk about integration versus return. 62% of Albanians, there was a mass research, almost 1/3 of IDPs in Kosovo were interviewed. 62% of Albanians do want to return to their place of origin, while 93% of Serbians who live in private accommodations and 83% of Serbians who live in collective centers do not want to return to their place of origin. They want to integrate in the local community. This makes sense because if we take the factor of segregation, Serbians do not want to leave the majority Serb regions, and the same applies also for Albanian communities. Additionally, those IDPs have been displaced for more than 20 years. So you can imagine that we now have children of IDPs in the place of displacement, which is what they know as a home. This is where their social networks are based. But also another reason why they do not want to return back is because of the various barriers they face. They lack property rights, they have security fears, and they lack a sustainable return framework. Speaking of the framework, now I want us to concentrate again about the war. One of the post-conflict areas of interest was the safe return of both refugees and IDPs. That was something that the international community really had an impact on, but also Kosovo is really now doing various things in changing their legal framework in order for IDPs to return back. However, we see that the numbers are decreasing. Although you have partial de jure facilitation of IDPs' needs, still some of their needs are not reflected in legal framework, for example, when it comes to property rights. So how am I with time? Okay. So regarding property rights, Serbia and Kosovo engaged into the so-called Brussels dialogue in 2011, which aimed to resolve technical issues between Belgrade and Pristina. One of those issues were for Serbia to return the cadastral records, so property records that they took from Pristina during 98-99 war. So Pristina was urging Serbia to return the records back because then Kosovo didn't have valid data and they didn't know which property belonged to which person. Although this was in 2011, a decade after, we see that the process has been very slow because of low trust from Serbia to Kosovo authorities. This means that IDP's immovable property is still illegally occupied or remains empty due to their displacement. Also, they cannot prove many times that their property belongs to them, and their needs are not covered in the legal framework because the cadastral records notifies whenever they find the person, they notify them based on the address that they have declared, but IDPs many often change their addresses. They always go from one place to another, and the legal framework doesn't include them. So that's from Kosovo, and now Serbia time. Nothing at all.
Regarding this, yes. Okay. Regarding Serbia, as Stamatis already stated, Serbia does not recognize Kosovo as a state, and it refers to as territory of Kosovo and Metohija. Metohija is part of Kosovo, but in Serbian narrative, it's always together, Kosovo and Metohija. And one of the, let's say, interesting facts about IDPs in Serbia is that their number stayed the same for almost 20 years. So data from 2005 shows that there were 209,021 IDPs, and now the most recent data shows that there's only 8,000 IDPs less. So that is something to investigate. There is only one collective center in the territory of Serbia, and there is only about 50 to 60 people located there, mostly of Roma minority. Most of these IDPs that are outside of collective centers are located in the southern part of Serbia, which is in a way understandable because, as you can see on the map, the light green is Kosovo and the dark green is Serbia, so they remain close to the territory of Kosovo. There are also local action plans, which are mechanisms that are developed to better the position of the IDPs in Serbia, and they are actually developed and adopted in 135 municipalities and cities in Serbia, out of which 12 are located in Kosovo and Metohija. Since 2008, IDPs are also beneficiaries of IPA programs, which are programs funded by the European Union. It's actually instrument for pre-accession assistance. So there are financial instruments that help countries that are on its way to European Union, but Serbia is on its way for a long time. One of the most important documents regarding IDPs in Serbia is national strategy. It's national strategy for resolving problems of refugees and IDPs for a period of from 2015 to 2020. So it expired 2 years ago, but it's the most recent document targeting specifically IDPs. And actually, it never implemented its action plan, so it wasn't really a success. When it comes, as you mentioned, to legal framing, the #1 document is national strategy. There are also some other strategies that are not directly concerning IDPs, but some of the subcategories of people that are also IDPs, like strategy for the social inclusion of Roma men and women in the Republic of Serbia, and it's actually still active. It's for the period of 2016 to 2025. And there is also migration management strategy of the Republic of Serbia. There are 2 laws that are, again, not directly targeting this group of people. This is a law on asylum and temporary protection and law on migration management. And all this is connected with the work of the Commissariat for Refugees and Migration that actually deal with everything regarding the IDPs. So they are the #1 institution when it comes to the tackling the issues of the IDPs. There is also a readmission agreement that Serbia signed with the European Union, but we can talk about that a bit later. The topic that we investigated the most is the social status of IDPs, and like in all countries, it's worse than the rest of the population. The data from 2010 shows that around 45% of them are poor regarding the general population, which is 9.2% in Serbia. There are also higher unemployment rates. The education is also the status. The last finished education is usually lower than the rest of the population, so they are not really. They don't really have high education usually, and if they work, it's usually illegal work because often they also lack some kind of documents and work for low wages or even below the minimum wage in Serbia. Government is mostly dealing with this problem that they often live out of welfare, which also stimulates other problems like discrimination and prejudices regarding this group of people. And actually one survey of the UNDP showed that one of the most discriminated groups are IDPs, but especially Roma IDPs that face double discrimination. Other issues, also health issues, because 25% of them stated that they suffer from some kind of health problems, and the most severe issue is the housing, which we will deal with next. No, actually it's written, sorry. So as Tamatis said, there is not much will among the Serbs from Kosovo to return to this to their homeland. Only around 20,000 or less than 60% returned, and the return is actually not really going on, or at least in really low numbers. And those people that returned, both Serbs and non-Serbs, but that are also non-Albanians, so like Roma and other minorities that used to live in Kosovo, returned predominantly to northern Kosovo, where there are still Serbs, and the rest is mostly populated by the Albanians. And the most relevant document for the return of the IDPs is the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1244, and it's Annex #1 from 1999, but that is actually not in force because, as we know, Kosovo declared independence, but still Serbia and some other UN country members find this resolution legally binding, which was also created to, as Stamatis said, to allow presence of the civilian and military personnel of internationally of the United Nations in Kosovo to end the conflict there, but also to secure the safe return of the refugees and IDPs to their houses. The #1 reason that is there for the lack of return is fear, and also no housing, because most of the houses are either destroyed or they are forbidden to return physically because of the ethnic hatred and so on, and they also fear social exclusion. So the last one is the issue of housing, which, as we said, is one of the biggest issues, and it's also stated as one of the strategic aims in the national strategy. on the surface level, we may see that like there is no obvious problem because there is only one remaining collective center where around 60 people live. But most of the IDPs in Serbia are not homeowners, and they either rent homes, 30% of them, or they live with their relatives or families. So they don't have independence in that way. And also more than 90% of Roma IDPs live in terrible conditions, as it is stated by the Special Rapporteur for Adequate Housing and other UN bodies. So the main reason why for this is the lack of financial means, because Serbia is not in a great economic situation, and there are not, I guess, enough resources to solve this problem. Although there were some housing programs, and actually 4,500 housings were provided for IDPs in need, but still there is a lot of people that need them. And since we wrote this paper, actually draft of it, we found some new information that there is actually also there are also people that have the status of IDPs, but are actually having only their legal address in the territory of Kosovo and Metohija, but living in the other part of Serbia. So they are in a way exploiting this situation because there are no taxes in Kosovo and of the welfare, but this is also one of the aspects that we need to investigate more. And now I will give my words to Natasha. Marisa, sorry.
Can you hear me? Yes, because my colleague tend to say that I can't speak loudly, so I'll try my best. And now, dear colleagues, we are moving to the last part of our presentation before the conclusion, which is Bosnia and Herzegovina. And when it comes to Bosnia and Herzegovina, it's very, very important to take into consideration that the majority of social and economic challenges that the country is facing nowadays, including the IDP issue, all of them are related to the very complex political system based upon the Dayton Peace Agreement, which was signed in 1995. What is the Dayton Peace Agreement? It's a document that and the program that was supposed to be a temporary solution to end up the war, the Bosnian War. It lasted from 1992 to 1995. About 100,000 people were killed during this war. 900,000 people became refugees, and more than 1,300,000 people were internally displaced. So this agreement divided the country into two parts, roughly equal to the size. The first part is Republika Srpska, with the majority of Serbs, and the second one is the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, with the majority of Bosniaks and also many Croats. This agreement established a complicated system with the three-member body of the head of the state. So basically, it's kind of power sharing mechanism and like a collective presidency, we could say. So there is one Bosniak, one Croat, they elected from the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and one Serb from Republika Srpska. As you can see, this is really, really complicated, but it's not the end, because as a chair on top, there is a Bričko district that was formed later in 2000 as a single administrative unit with their own self-government. So with all of this quite chaotic and really complicated system, all the decisions made up by authorities, they have to undergo a very long process to be implemented, and many of decisions are declined during the process. And because of this, after 27 years since the end of the war, the issue of IDP still remains unsolved. Yesterday, our colleagues already mentioned that IDPs, comparing to refugees, they have quite a fragile nature of their status. And in Bosnia and Herzegovina, it's still a case as well. For instance, in 1999, it was a huge protest in the town called Valjež. It's a town closer to Sarajevo, the capital. Bosnian Croats IDPs were protesting because they had the perception that Bosnian Croats who were about to return into country after the war, they could have more privileges comparing to them in terms of housing. Because, as we already mentioned, refugees who hold the official status of refugee, they're protected by the international law. And then they also can have some sort of perks from both sides, from their host country if they want to return, and from the country of origin if they want to return, and from their host country. And those protesters were really, really worried what can it be with them, because all the housing, all the efforts will go to the returnees. And then it's unfair because, of course, IDPs, they also have to be protected, especially because they were the ones who stayed, and they were the ones who faced all the war circumstances and all the consequences at the age of survival. But not only comparing to refugees, IDPs felt back then and still now this restriction when it comes to their rights, but also among their own community, the rights are not equal. Because during the first years since the war, the end of the war, it was a law, the property restriction laws, they provided IDPs with the right to have an alternative accommodation as a part of mechanism of compensation for the damage caused by the war. But later on, December 2001, there were amendments to this law. And according to them, those people who didn't receive the accommodation by 2002, they couldn't apply anymore, they couldn't get it, and it was replaced as a form of emergency accommodation, which, as Marina already said, and my colleagues before, is usually a collective center. And of course, this is a huge lack of their rights to have adequate housing. And still, it's a huge issue because by the end of last year, 2021, as Marina said, 8,000 people still live in the collective centers in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And across the country, there are 158 collective centers. Everywhere there is a huge problem of the lack to basic hygienic needs, medical assistance, and it's, of course, a framework for poverty and crime. Because also many people, like society, who didn't face this IDP issue, they tend to marginalize those people. And unfortunately, those people, they have to face this problem of living on the edge of having basic needs. And a new generation, just like in the countries of the focus of my colleagues, is also growing up in these collective centers right now. And those kids, they haven't had a chance to see any other circumstances in their life. So they have limited access to education, to job market, and it directly affects the future of the country. And that's why it requires action from the government immediately. And here we'll go a bit more with legal framework.
Okay, so first of all, it is worth noting that if you hear anything that you have already heard about Bosnia, that's because Professor Manfred stole our presentation, and in his speech today covered a lot of the things we are covering. But when it comes to the legal framework, the ridiculously complicated system of Bosnia and Herzegovina becomes even more complicated because the Dayton Peace Agreement gives very wide authority and autonomy to both entities and the district to make up their own laws, which in turn have to be in line with the state constitution and state laws. When it comes to the state constitution, that is actually Annex 4 of the Dayton Peace Agreement, and the main law that actually deals with IDPs and refugees is the Annex 7 of the Dayton Peace Agreement. In this annex, it is emphasized the importance of urgent return of all of the IDPs and refugees, which is a reflection of the fact that IDPs were a significant issue, not only for the individuals who were affected by the problem, but also for the entire society in the process of transitional justice and transition in entirety. On the basis of this Annex 7 of the Dayton Peace Agreement, in 2003, strategy for implementation of the annex was formed, and in 2010 it was revised. This strategy identifies needs of the IDPs, and it helps all of the actors who are dealing with the issue, not only to help the individuals, but to actually monitor and evaluate the progress itself. What the strategy actually identifies as the biggest needs are sadly basic human rights and housing, because in the post-war context, they were lacking all of it. What is also interesting, as Marina mentioned, that the closure of the collective shelters were expected to be in 2022. The first time that the closure of collective shelters is actually mentioned is in 2003, and then again in 2010, in 2021, 2022, and now we are moving to 2023. It is also for the strategy important that it actually points out the fact of intersectionality of IDPs, or the fact that they are under several layers of discrimination and they're enduring multiple vulnerabilities. And those are firstly age, because the majority of the IDP population are seniors, but also unemployment and usually disabilities.
Thank you very much. And now we will go a bit more into Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Republika Srpska separately, because this is completely different case, as you can see. Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina comprise 51% of the area and consists of 10 autonomous cantons with their own authorities, of course. And across the country, there are 2,200,000 people. The majority of them are Bosniaks, about 70%, and Croats, there are 22% of them. When it comes to IDPs, we can see the dynamics in the slide. In 2005, in the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, IDPs, they were 53% of IDPs, and it was like the number of 98,000. And then 12 years later, you can see it decreased, but 12 years later, I mean, of course it should decrease. But not that much, because still there are 36,000 IDPs, and it's about 38%. As Marina and Natasha already mentioned, of course, there were attempts to change the situation and to close the collective centers. And there is this strategic plan provided by the Federal Ministry of Displaced Persons and Refugees. According to this plan, the main goal is to ensure the reconstruction of housing units for the needs of IDPs, floors of the collective centers and alternative accommodation for returnees, and construction of housing, social housing for young returning families. As a result of this program, so far we have the results by the end of last year. In the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, 250,000 housing units have been renovated out of 350,000 in total. So the work has been in progress, but it does not go with regards of the matter of urge in solving this issue. The lack of the right to adequate housing leads to an extreme high level of poverty. And as you can see in the slide, the incomes, it's just a joke. I mean, we cannot even compare the incomes of IDPs to the incomes of the Bosnian citizens. like the average net. So 83% of the IDPs based in the Federation have an average monthly income of less than 200 marks, which is about 102 euros per family member per month. And 59% of them, they live on less than 100 marks, which is 51 euros per month. 51 euros per month. Just think about it. And these numbers, of course, they lie way below the average net wages of Bosnian citizens, which is estimated as 1,059 marks, or approximately 541 euros.
Okay, now we will return to the second entity, which is Republika Srpska. It's an entity that is on the 49% of the territory and in which majority of the Serb population live. As you can see, in 2005, the total IDP population in entire Bosnia was 186,000 people, out of which 46% was within Republika. But in 2017, while the total population dropped, the percentage of IDPs which were in Republika Srpska rose to 61%. This is the result of a specific for and post-war context of Republika Srpska, which we will get into in a few seconds. But firstly, let's just go through the legal framework. As I have already mentioned, there are state laws which regulate all, to some extent, and entity laws. And in Republika Srpska, there is a Secretariat for Internally Displaced and Migrations, and also there is an entity law. This entity law on internally displaced and refugees deals with rights and entitlements, but the problem is it usually focuses on short-term and very narrow solutions like cash benefits, which usually do not produce any long-term solutions. When it comes to the return of the IDPs within Republika Srpska, majority of the returnees are minority returnees. And return in that sense is much harder because of the war context of Republika Srpska. In that sense, Republika Srpska during the Bosnian War was the place of some of the biggest war atrocities that have happened in the Bosnian War, which culminated in the Srebrenica genocide in 1995. And due to these events, the entire territory was basically ethnically completely cleansed, and the entire demographic structure of the territory was completely changed, which is the reason why majority of the IDPs do not wish to return. Further, some of the authorities in Republika Srpska are the ones who were actually responsible for war atrocities, who were taking active participation in the war, which further kind of discourages IDPs to actually return to their previous homes. Also, there is significant lack of political will for this solution to be solved. And this is not just in Republika Srpska, but in entire Bosnia, because the majority of the IDPs usually claim that the authorities talk to them and speak about them only in the election campaigns. In that sense, when it comes to return, our Republika Srpska sort of presents source of general IDPs in Bosnia, because on the basis of a report from 2005, almost half of the IDP population in entire Bosnia came from only 10 municipalities in Republika Srpska. When it comes to the socio-economic status, it is, as Lisa mentioned, very poor. Almost 70% of the entire population of IDPs is unemployed, which in turn reflects on the income of the IDPs in Republika Srpska. With almost half of the IDPs earning less than 100 marks or 50 euros per household member, and almost 60% of the returnees also earn less than 50 euros. When it comes to also collective centers, as we have already mentioned, they are in very poor conditions, and there is no point in the future when we can expect them actually being closed down. Also, transparency in actually reporting on what is happening with the IDPs is severely lacking, because the things we can hear are only the politicians saying that they will eventually close the collective shelters. Other than that, we don't know what the situation is. Yes, so we are kind of wrapping this up because I think we are running out of time. When it comes to the conclusion, even though all these states are having very different contexts, we kind of wanted to focus on the similarities between them, just to sort of find the patterns which can eventually help actually to resolve the issue. And in that sense, similarities, firstly, is the fact that none of these issues were resolved even almost 30 years after the war. And there is always continuation of the issue and further marginalization of the people who were affected by the internal displacement. Also, there is a very narrow and short-term approach to the issue, where majority of the politicians, laws, and legal frameworks do not consider the fact that this issue should be resolved in a long term. There is also this issue is highly politicized, and not only politicized, but is used in nationalistic rhetorics. Intersectionality also. But what is important really is the fact that we see now that we can now observe again rising tensions in the region once again. And we believe deeply that this issue should be one of the main points in the processes of transitional justice. And in that sense, that resolving this issue would be a way of peace building and reconciliation and actually making a just society that all of these countries need. Thank you.
The team from Southeast Europe. I think they've done a good job, but I guess what they've really showed us is the fact that conflict takes a long time to deal with. You know, the impact. It's 30 years and we're still here talking about, you know, the inability of those who are affected to resettle, to regain their lives. And maybe it's a lesson for a lot of us who are still either at the beginning of, you know, conflict or we're midway, to sort of think about what kind of approaches will we take. Of course, the point is to identify a more long-term commitment as well, but, you know, the thing is, I think for the international community, every time a conflict ends, we think the war is over, we move on to the next conflict and forget about how people rebuild their lives, which is a missed opportunity. But anyway, I want to open it up to invite the group who are reviewing their paper to give them feedback. I don't know which team was reviewing. The caucuses for reviewing your papers. So yes, please come forward and offer your comments, feedback to the group. Then we'll open it up to the larger audience before we can wrap it. Thank you.
All right, first of all, thank you for your insightful information and all your research that you have done. It is very informative in terms of getting more knowledge about the area that you included. However, we made some of the questions and peer review for you. So we have 5 questions. First one, you decided to use as much inclusive as possible definition of IDP that is not in line with the universal international standard in area. Could you please elaborate this issue and explain your choice? Okay, I will ask all the questions. Second one. Why do you use list of abbreviations if in the text you use full names of these terms? The third one. What's the general legal framework of the IDP status in Kosovo? And unfortunately, authors provide different and it's not correlated information in this research. Fourth, authors mentioned that readmission agreement is on the 16th page. Between whom this agreement was concluded? And the last question is that, is there any program in Serbia to remuneration or restitution according to the Pinero principles?
Okay, so thank you for your questions. When it comes to the, oh, sorry. When it comes to the first question regarding definition, Marina briefly mentioned it in the introduction. It is due to a very complex political situation, and we believe that the general definition that is offered by the international community may not include all of the actual IDPs in the region. That is why we use the definition that was offered by one of the authors. Because there are situations, for example, in Bosnia, where people are still living in the municipality that they have lived before the war, but they had to leave their homes. So they are actually IDPs because they cannot return to maybe their street that they have lived in. Second, it was because of the list of abbreviations, it was just a technical oversight, which we will eventually fix, of course, for the final draft.
Regarding the question on Kosovo, we already said that the UN Security Council Resolution 1144 is a whole article connecting with IDPs. The article reads: the Republic of Kosovo shall promote and facilitate the safe and dignified return of refugees and IDPs and assist them in recovering their property and possession. Also, Kosovo has actually a ministry for community and return, which is focusing on the safe return of all refugees and IDPs from the 98, 99, and 2004 conflict. They have adopted twice actually a 4-year-long program, 2009 to 2014, 2014 to 2018. And now we are also waiting 2021 to 2025 a new strategy that will draft new law, specifically focusing on addressing conflict events.
I would also like to add something to the first question. Regarding the first question about the definition of IDP, why do we use such a definition? Also, because it was Yugoslavia back then, and it was a real issue right after the war, with all the new borders, to actually understand from what kind of part was the person, and from what kind of part the person was displaced. So it was like a very huge issue. Under which territory the person was recognized before, and that's why, because it was an entire country, and then we have lots of countries in this territory now. During the first years, it was a real issue. Now, of course, we can understand the borders more or less because it's still an issue, unfortunately. But yeah, back then it was just a huge mess, and we wanted to take the regional context to provide us with the providing all the information.
So the question number 3 regarding the readmission agreement, it is signed, as I said, between the Republic of Serbia and the European Union, and it was signed on September 18, 2007, and it has been in force since 2008. And it is concerning the persons residing without authorization. This last question: is there any problem in Serbia on regarding PNA principles? So actually, there is not, because Serbia was a country that was receiving refugees mostly, and there were not many refugees going from Serbia. So there are some PNA principles regarding Serbian citizens that were migrants that were refugees from Serbia. With their properties in Croatia, refugees from Croatia to Serbia with their properties in Croatia, and there are also, and since Kosovo now declared its independence, so it is the question for Kosovo about the PNA principles, since the housing and the properties are placed in Kosovo, not in Serbia, according to.
Yeah, thank you. And I think if we all the response from the the team that is reviewing the paper is done, I'll open it up to the audience, to the large group. Are there comments that you'd like to questions?
So thank you, first of all, congratulations to the team. we on the part of Southeastern Europe also very proud to have you presented here today. And your colleague Vincian is saying hello from Iceland.
Oh.
And hello to all the Erasmus students that are following us online. In line with what you've been saying and what Teddy has commented and what we discussed with Professor Novak in the past, like what would be your view, and maybe this is just a question that goes into the air in case of the return of IDPs. As a student myself in 2003, I was doing my internship at the office of the High Commissioner, of the OHR, sorry, the High Representative. I was writing on the right to housing, and I was working in the Return and Reconstruction Task Force. By the time I finished my thesis and I defended it, the OHR has closed down the Return and Reconstruction Task Force. Because in 2003, they had decided that the return has been complete. This, of course, shows that it's never complete. I mean, it also depends on how the data is being collected. If people would come back to their municipality, to their street, to their home, they would spend the night there because there was no infrastructure. There is no electricity, there is no water, so you couldn't live there. They would spend the night, try to gather, I don't know, photographs, whatever, and they would be counted as a returnee. So this map, it was the municipality assessment question that they did for all the communities, and they OHR took big pride in the data that they have collected. However, it was in the end just numbers that were maybe had importance for what OHR did, for what the municipalities did, for the security situation. However, it's 31st of May 2022, and the numbers are still there. So I really don't know how, I mean, yes, prevention support, but like what to do, like maybe the people with the legal background and that have followed conflicts in other areas would have some kind of best practice, although I think the word best is really wrong to use for this situation. Thank you.
Any other comments? Any other? No? Oh, it was a big lunch.
Yeah, thanks very much as well. Just following up from Mariana. I mean, under Annex 7, you had the more or less absolute right. If you're a refugee or an IDP, you go back to the house where you have been living before 1991. And many people at that time, in the 90s, couldn't, were afraid, etc. But then minority returns started, and many people actually then also offered the possibility of a compensation. So they wouldn't go back actually, but they would get compensation. Now, these people now who voluntarily kind of said, I don't want to go back, are they still considered as IDPs in these figures in the RS? Are you sure about that?
No, there's in the end of the law, it also defines who is the IDP and who is the refugee. And is not refugee, but when the status of IDP actually ceases to exist. And in that sense, every person who voluntarily gives up their status like IDP or voluntarily decides to stay in another housing unit or host municipality or whatever, their status ceases completely.
So regarding this, it is also quite difficult to define who are IDPs and who are refugees in Balkans. But for example, from the Kosovo side, the IDPs in Serbia are not IDPs but refugees, since Kosovo is an independent state. But from the Serbian side, there are IDPs since Serbia considers Kosovo as part of Serbia. And yeah, we can go on like with Yugoslavia the same, because at some moment it was the same country and they were IDPs and they became refugees.
Okay, any other comments? Okay. I think I want to take the pleasure now to thank the group. We need to give them a big thank you for a great meeting. Thank you very much for your impressive work. We hope with all this feedback and we'll continue to working on the papers from here that will develop them further so that by the time we get to the final stages, they will be a bit more refined for share. Thank you very much. And yeah, what is it? Oh yes, some announcement.
Warmly for tonight. Yeah.
The bus leaves at 4:30.
Okay, yeah, so I guess everybody had the bus is leaving at 4:30 for dinner. And remember to dress warm because we're going to be out of there.
Thank you. I was waiting for someone to say that.
Samo kod mogu da se kaže